The year was 1858. In a small New England town, hidden among the rolling fields and weathered farmhouses, the Prescott family prepared for something that most families of their time hoped they would never have to endure. Two of their sons, Thomas and Edward, were gone, or at least that was what the official story claimed. Their lifeless bodies had been dressed in stiff collars and dark wool coats, propped upright as if merely dozing after Sunday service. And then came the moment that would carve their names into the annals of dark history. The photograph. To the untrained eye, it might appear to be another relic from the Victorian era, an old photo, sepia-toned, a reminder of how fleeting childhood once was. Post-mortem photography, after all, was common in the 19th century. Families facing unimaginable loss clung to the eerie ritual of capturing their departed in staged portraits. It was not unusual to see the dead posed with the living, their glassy eyes painted to mimic life, their bodies stiffly held upright to deceive the gaze of time. But this image was different, disturbing in a way that defied even the macabre traditions of its day. The Prescott brothers' faces were too soft, too alive, their lips parted as though a whisper had just passed between them. Their eyelids, heavy yet imperfectly shut, seemed caught mid-blink. And if one stares long enough at the photograph, there are details, subtle, yet chilling, that suggest the boys were not truly gone when the camera's lens captured them. A faint clench in the hand of the younger brother, a shadow beneath the chin of the elder, as if his neck strained against the stillness imposed upon him. This was more than grief immortalized. This was horror storytelling written in silver nitrate, a mystery frozen in time. By the late 1800s, whispers about the Prescott family had spread beyond their small town. Collectors of forbidden photographs passed the image quietly from hand to hand, calling it one of the most disturbing images ever taken. Some swore that staring too long into the boys' eyes brought dreams, nightmares, of scratching beneath coffin lids, of muffled cries swallowed by earth. Others claimed the photograph carried a curse, that those who kept it in their homes would suffer mysterious disappearances among their children. To understand why this single photograph became one of the most unsettling mysteries of its century, you must first understand the world in which it was created. The mid-19th century was a time obsessed with death. Disease was relentless. Scarlet fever, cholera, diphtheria, all struck without warning, carrying away the young before parents had time to prepare. Families, desperate for a way to hold on to what had been stolen, turned to post-mortem photography as a means of keeping the dead close, of freezing a fleeting presence. Yet even among thousands of such photographs, the Prescott portrait stands apart, because the rumors insist the brothers were not yet dead. This possibility is not as far-fetched as it may seem. In the 1800s, medicine was crude, diagnoses were uncertain, and the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin. Countless documented cases describe people declared dead, only to awaken hours or days later, buried alive, suffocated in their own coffins. It was a horror so widespread that safety coffins were patented with bells and breathing tubes, inventions born from the fear that one might be interred before their final breath had left them. The Prescotts were a respected family, though strange in their own ways. Their patriarch was stern, their matriarch devoutly religious, and their children, 4 in total, were raised under strict rules that stifled joy. Yet tragedy has a way of haunting families who live in shadows. By the spring of 1858, 2 of their children were suddenly gone, their deaths attributed to a fever that burned through their household with unnatural speed, or so the doctor said. But neighbors whispered of something else. They spoke of how the boys had been seen playing in the yard just hours before they were declared dead, of how the town physician seemed uncertain, stammering, his hands shaking as he signed the death certificates. And then there was the matter of the photograph itself, commissioned not days after death, as was custom, but immediately, almost urgently, as if the family wished to prove something to the world, or perhaps hide it. The photograph was taken in a dimly lit parlor, curtains drawn to block the sun. The brothers were arranged together, their bodies placed in poses of eerie serenity. But what the camera captured went far beyond the intended memorial. It captured ambiguity. Were those children corpses, or captives of a mistake no one dared admit? For generations, the image has been studied, debated, whispered about. Some historians call it a tragic artifact of a grieving family. Others insist it is proof of a crime, or worse, an accident covered up to protect reputations. Still others see it as one of those unsettling histories that defy explanation, a photograph that should not exist, a record of something we are not meant to understand. Look closely at the photograph. The pale faces, the parted lips, the eyelids caught between life and death. Look long enough, and you might feel it, the same creeping unease that collectors and historians alike have described. The feeling that you are not looking at the dead, but at the dying. This is where the story begins. With a family that held chilling secrets, with children who vanished in silence, with an unsettling history buried beneath layers of denial and rumor, and with a photograph that continues to ask one question more horrifying than any other. Were the Prescott brothers buried alive? The year was 1858, and the Prescotts of Massachusetts were known, at least on the surface, as a family of respectability. Their homestead stood on the edge of a quiet village, framed by frost-bitten fields and a small cemetery that the locals avoided after nightfall. The Prescott house itself was an imposing structure, dark wooden beams, shuttered windows, a home that seemed to breathe with the weight of secrets. Behind its doors lived a family who, to the public eye, appeared upright, devout, and firmly rooted in the old traditions. But history tells us that appearances deceive. And when it comes to strange families lost in time, the Prescotts are among the most unsettling. The patriarch, Jonathan Prescott, was a stern man, known for his rigid discipline and cold demeanor. Neighbors described him as a figure carved of stone, rarely seen smiling, often pacing the property with a leather-bound Bible in hand. He believed in punishment, in control, in silencing disobedience before it had time to bloom. His wife, Margaret, was equally strict, though her harshness was veiled beneath the language of piety. She prayed often, whispered passages of scripture at all hours, and taught her children that suffering was not a curse, but a divine lesson. Together, they raised 4 children, 2 daughters, and the 2 boys who would soon meet their infamous fate. Life under their roof was not one of warmth. The Prescott household was ruled by silence. Meals were taken without conversation, eyes cast downward, utensils clinking against porcelain like ritual bells. Laughter, according to those who knew them, was a forbidden language. The children played little. They studied scripture and memorized rules, their only escape found in the woods beyond the farm. But even in the village, the Prescotts were spoken of in hushed tones. There were whispers of eerie details, of how Jonathan Prescott locked his children in their rooms during storms, believing thunder was a trial sent by God, of how Margaret would forbid her daughters from singing, claiming music stirred sinful spirits. And then there was the family's strange obsession with death. Neighbors recounted seeing the Prescott children walking the cemetery grounds at dusk, guided by their father, who insisted they study the gravestones. They were taught to read the names of vanished children aloud, to trace their fingers across carved dates, to meditate on how fragile life was. It was a ritual that unsettled others, but Jonathan Prescott defended it. He told the town that confronting death made his children strong, immune to fear. But perhaps it had the opposite effect. Perhaps it awakened something sinister. The 2 boys, Thomas, age 9, and Edward, age 7, were described as quiet, withdrawn, and strangely watchful. Unlike other children, they did not run or play freely. They lingered at the edges of gatherings, pale and stiff, their eyes fixed on people with an intensity that made some uneasy. A schoolteacher once remarked that Edward never blinked when spoken to. Thomas, the elder, drew pictures of coffins in the margins of his lessons, his handwriting neat but his sketches unsettlingly precise. These were not the habits of ordinary children. And yet, in 1858, tragedy struck, or so it was said. The 2 boys, once seen wandering the village green, were suddenly gone. Within days, the Prescotts announced both had died of fever, claimed swiftly and cruelly. The doctor's diagnosis was accepted, though many doubted his certainty. After all, Thomas and Edward had appeared healthy that very week. No wasting illness, no visible decline. Just two boys who vanished into silence, their absence explained away by a family whose relationship with death had always been unnervingly intimate. The funeral was held quickly, too quickly, some would argue. The brothers were dressed in stiff black coats, their hair combed with meticulous care, their small bodies displayed as though sleep had claimed them. It was then that the infamous photograph was taken. To outsiders, it was a tragic relic, another example of post-mortem photography. But to those who knew the Prescotts, who had seen the family's fascination with graves, the image carried an unshakable sense of dread, because the Prescotts were no strangers to disturbing images. In fact, Jonathan Prescott kept a collection of photographs, many of which depicted the dead. Visitors described them as a gallery of unsettling history pinned to his walls, faces pale, eyes blank, children stiff in their final repose. He claimed they were reminders of mortality, proof of divine will, but the photograph of his own sons was different. Too lifelike. Too wrong. It did not help that the Prescotts spoke little of their sons afterward. There was no mourning, no public grief. Instead, the family withdrew, shutters drawn tighter, the house even darker. The daughters were rarely seen, and when they appeared, they moved with a silence that mirrored their parents. To the town, the Prescotts became a haunted place all their own, a household wrapped in chilling secrets. Over time, stories grew. Children in the village whispered that the Prescott boys had not died at all, that their cries could be heard at night, echoing from beneath the soil in the churchyard. Others claimed the photograph itself was cursed, that staring too long at it brought feverish dreams. Whether fact or folklore, one truth remained. The Prescotts were never the same. The family had always been strange, but after 1858, they were something more. Something sinister. And so the story lingers. A strict father, a devout mother, children taught to revere death instead of life. Two sons, gone without warning, immortalized in a photograph that continues to disturb those who see it. Were the Prescott boys victims of fever or of something far darker? Did the family's obsession with death blind them to signs of life, or did it lead them to bury their children before their time? The truth remains hidden inside the shadows of that house, the whispers of a family long since vanished. But the photograph survives, and it will always ask the same haunting question. Were the Prescott brothers truly dead, or were they buried alive? The year was 1858, and to understand the Prescott brothers' fate, we must first understand the world that surrounded them. A world where death was not an unwelcome guest, but a constant companion. This was a century haunted by illness, famine, and sudden disappearance. In every village, in every city, children vanished into the arms of sickness, leaving parents desperate for ways to hold on to what little remained. Victorian society, bound by ritual and superstition, developed a strange relationship with death. It was everywhere, and so it was studied, photographed, romanticized. The boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, until grief itself became an art form. To walk the streets of Massachusetts in the 1850s was to walk among reminders of mortality. Black mourning dresses, solemn wakes held in parlor rooms, and endless rows of gravestones carved with skulls, angels, and epitaphs. For families like the Prescotts, this was daily life. And yet, the practices of mourning took on unsettling forms. One of the most disturbing was post-mortem photography. In the age before handheld cameras, photographs were rare and precious. Most families never had the chance to sit for a portrait while alive. So, when death struck, photographers were summoned to capture what was left. Dead children were dressed in fine clothes, posed with their parents, sometimes even painted to appear as though their eyes were open. For grieving families, these old photos became treasures. For us, they are disturbing images, frozen scenes that look almost alive, yet utterly wrong. The Prescott photograph was part of this tradition, but it carried something darker. Because unlike most, this one revealed eerie details that would fuel whispers for generations. A parted lip, a clenched hand, eyes too heavy to be closed, a reminder that in a time obsessed with death, mistakes could not only be made, they could be immortalized. But post-mortem photography was not the only sign of obsession. Across America and Europe, societies were building entire industries around grief. Hair from the dead was woven into jewelry and worn close to the heart. Death masks were pressed into wax to preserve the features of the departed. Mourning rituals could last months, even years, with entire households draped in black. Some families spoke to the dead, setting plates at dinner tables as though their children might return. To outsiders, this might sound like horror storytelling. But in the 19th century, it was life itself. Still, one fear lingered stronger than all others: the fear of being buried alive. This was not paranoia without cause. Reports from the time described coffins opened to reveal bodies twisted in agony, claw marks on the lids, fingernails torn away in desperate attempts to escape. The line between life and death was fragile, and without modern medical certainty, people were declared dead far too soon. It became an unsolved mystery repeated across towns. How many of those buried were still alive when the soil closed over them? This fear gave rise to chilling inventions. Safety coffins were designed with bells or tubes to allow the living dead to signal for rescue. Some cemeteries even stationed watchmen to listen for cries from beneath the ground. It was a silent terror woven into the fabric of Victorian life. And in this world of blurred boundaries, the Prescott brothers' photograph took on a sinister meaning. Because what if the whispers were true? What if those boys, dressed and propped for the camera, had not yet crossed the threshold? Even beyond the graveyards and photographs, death seeped into the culture in other ways. Families spoke in forbidden languages of the spirit world, experimenting with seances, spirit boards, and mediums who promised to communicate with vanished children. The Prescott's neighbors told of secret gatherings in candlelit rooms, where parents wept as strangers claimed to deliver messages from the beyond. Whether trickery or truth, these rituals became a way to cope with loss. But they also opened doors that some believed should have remained shut. The Prescotts themselves were steeped in this atmosphere. Jonathan Prescott's collection of photographs was not just personal, it was part of a wider obsession sweeping across America. Death was no longer an end. It was a presence to be studied, remembered, even displayed. And yet, with this fascination came darker questions. Were these practices truly about memory, or were they about control? Were families like the Prescotts seeking comfort, or feeding a more sinister hunger? The Prescott photograph survives as a reminder of this world. It is more than an artifact. It is a mirror reflecting the unsettling history of a society that blurred life and death so completely that mistakes were inevitable. The brothers' still faces remind us not only of their personal tragedy, but of a culture that demanded their likeness long after breath had left their lungs, or perhaps before it truly had. In the end, the obsession with death left behind countless disturbing images, chilling secrets, and eerie families like the Prescotts, whose name is now tied forever to one unsettling mystery. A photograph that shouldn't exist. A moment captured between life and death. A hidden truth lost in time. And so we return to the question at the heart of this story. What was truly happening in the Prescott house that year? Was it grief? Was it negligence? Or was it something more sinister, something bound to a family who lived in the shadows of graves? Look again at the photograph. Look closely. What do you see? The lifeless stillness of death, or the final flickers of life, trapped in an image that refuses to let go? The year was 1858, and the Prescott house stood in silence. It was late autumn, when the air carried the smell of damp leaves and smoke from hearth fires. Within those shuttered walls, the family whispered of a sudden illness. Two boys, once seen chasing each other across the yard only days before, had fallen gravely ill. Their names, Thomas and Edward, were spoken in hushed tones, as though even mentioning them aloud might provoke the fever's return. At first, it was dismissed as nothing more than the common chill of the season. New England winters were cruel, and children often suffered coughs and fevers that burned quickly and then faded. But with the Prescott brothers, the sickness arrived with a strange swiftness, consuming them in hours rather than days. Neighbors recalled how only the night before, Edward had been seen at the well, drawing water with a bucket too heavy for his small frame. The next morning, he was confined to his bed, pale and sweating, whispering in a voice no louder than the creak of the floorboards. Thomas followed soon after. He was the stronger of the two, but strength meant nothing against what came. The doctor who was summoned, an aging man with trembling hands, found both boys burning with fever, their eyes glazed, their bodies shivering violently. Yet when he pressed his ear to their chests, he hesitated. Their hearts beat faintly, irregularly, as though trapped between two worlds. He offered no clear explanation. He muttered only of malignant fever and left instructions for rest, prayer, and cold compresses. The Prescotts obeyed, but doubt lingered. Jonathan Prescott sat by his son's bedsides with his Bible open, murmuring prayers that sounded less like comfort and more like command. Margaret wept quietly in the corner, though her tears seemed restrained, as if grief itself was forbidden. The daughters hovered in the doorway, pale, their eyes wide as though witnessing something they could not name. What happened in those final hours remained shrouded in mystery. According to the official account, the brothers grew weaker and weaker until they slipped away. But witnesses outside the home told different stories. Some claimed they heard muffled cries from within the Prescott house, not of grief but of protest. Voices rising, then silenced. Others whispered that the doctor had returned to check the boys one last time, only to leave in haste, his face as white as the sheets he left behind. The following day, the shutters were drawn tightly closed. No one entered, no one left. By evening, word spread. Both Prescott boys were dead. But the speed of their passing, the vagueness of the doctor's words, and the family's silence stirred suspicion. Families in 1858 were no strangers to sudden death. Children vanished from illness all the time. But this case carried eerie details that unsettled the town. The fever had no name. No other children in the area fell ill. No outbreak was recorded. The disease began and ended with Thomas and Edward, as though it had chosen only them. And then there was the matter of their appearance. Those who glimpsed the brothers after their passing described them as too peaceful, their cheeks still flushed with warmth, their lips not yet stiffened into death. It was said they looked asleep, not gone. This would not have been unusual in another household. But for the Prescotts, a family already spoken of in whispers, the image of two boys taken so quickly, so silently, was enough to fuel the darkest suspicions. Some claimed Jonathan Prescott rushed to arrange their burial, refusing to delay even a day. Others said Margaret insisted on the photograph being taken immediately, before any trace of decay could mar their features. It was as if the family wanted proof. Proof of death, or proof of something else. That night, as candles flickered in the parlor, the brothers were dressed in their best clothes. Their bodies were moved carefully, positioned side by side, as though simply resting. The photographer set up his heavy equipment, adjusting the plates, preparing the chemicals. And in that moment, a strange hush fell across the room. Witnesses later described the scene with unease. The boys' lips seemed moist, their hands limp rather than stiff. One daughter, perhaps too young to understand, was said to have whispered, "They are not sleeping." The sickness had come swiftly, inexplicably, and it had left just as suddenly. No trace remained but the still forms of two brothers and the haunting photograph that followed. Whether it was fever, misdiagnosis, or something far darker, the truth of what happened inside the Prescott house that day was locked away behind closed shutters. But the town remembered. The neighbors never forgot the eerie silence of that household, nor the speed with which life was declared extinguished. And when the photograph emerged, when those who saw it claimed the boys looked alive, the memory of that day of sickness grew into something more. It became the seed of a legend. A legend of children who were not dead, but silenced. Children who were not gone, but buried alive. The day of sickness was over, but the story of the Prescott brothers had only just begun. The morning after the boys' passing, the Prescott home stood under a heavy sky. The townsfolk of Massachusetts whispered of the fever that had struck so suddenly. But more than the sickness, It was the speed of the burial that unsettled them. In 1858, it was customary to keep the deceased at home for a day or two, both as a mourning ritual and to ensure that death was certain. Yet Jonathan Prescott insisted the funeral must happen at once. Neighbors who expected to be invited to view the bodies were turned away. The shutters stayed closed. The parlor, where coffins were usually displayed, remained strangely dark. Only a chosen few entered that house, and fewer still ever spoke of what they saw inside. One neighbor, an elderly woman who had known the Prescotts for years, muttered that she had been refused entry because the family wished for privacy. But her voice carried suspicion, for she had attended many funerals, and privacy was never part of the ritual. When the boys' coffins were finally brought outside, the gathering gasped. They were too small, too hastily built. The wood was plain, unpolished, as though carved in urgency. Some said Jonathan himself had overseen their construction the night before, working with a lantern in his barn until the early hours. The coffins looked rushed, unfit for children of a prominent family. The funeral procession was quiet, more restrained than the town expected. Margaret Prescott walked with lowered eyes, her veil hiding any trace of grief. Jonathan marched rigidly, his face set, unreadable. The daughters followed, pale and trembling, but no tears ran down their cheeks. It was as though the Prescotts were not mourning, but concealing. As the coffins were lowered into the earth, a strange thing happened. A sound, faint but undeniable, drifted through the still air. Some swore it was the wind. Others said it was the moan of a mother's grief. But a handful of witnesses, those standing closest to the open graves, whispered later that they heard knocking. Faint, muffled, rhythmic. A sound from inside. The officiant hesitated in his words. His eyes flicked toward Jonathan, who gave the smallest shake of his head, as though silencing even the priest. The service carried on. Dirt fell on wood, one handful at a time. The sound, if it had been real, vanished beneath the weight of soil. Afterward, people gathered in hushed groups at the edge of the cemetery. Some whispered that the boys had not been dead at all, that Jonathan, in his fervent desire to appear decisive, had condemned them to a living grave. Others suggested darker motives. Perhaps the Prescotts carried a family curse, or perhaps Jonathan believed the boys were touched by something unnatural, something better hidden beneath the earth. It was then that the photograph surfaced. Before the coffins were sealed, the family had summoned a photographer to capture the final image. Post-mortem photography was common in that era, a way to preserve memory in the face of fleeting life. Yet this image was unlike others. At first glance, the brothers appeared to be sleeping peacefully, their faces untouched by death. But the longer one looked, the stranger it seemed. Edward's lips were parted, as though he had been caught mid-breath. Thomas's hand, resting at his side, seemed relaxed, fingers curved as if ready to twitch, and their eyes, though closed, faint lines around the lids suggested tension, as if they had been forced shut. The photographer himself, when asked years later, admitted in a trembling voice that he had never been comfortable with the session. "They weren't gone," he whispered. "Not when I saw them." The town wanted to forget, but the details refused to fade. The rushed coffins, the silent funeral, the muffled sounds from beneath the soil, the haunting photograph that seemed to defy death itself. All of it combined into a chilling suspicion that what had been buried that day were not corpses, but children still clinging to life. And so the whispers began. At first, cautious, spoken only in kitchens and barns, then louder, spreading beyond Massachusetts. The Prescott boys were buried alive, people murmured. Their father knew, their mother obeyed. And the photograph is proof. The funeral that should never have happened marked the point where rumor became legend. It was no longer just the story of a family tragedy. It was a tale of dark history, of mistakes or choices too terrible to name. A story of children trapped between life and death, silenced not by fever, but by shovelfuls of earth. And long after the graves were filled, neighbors avoided the Prescott home. They said that at night, if you walked past the cemetery gates, you could hear faint scratching beneath the ground. Look closely at the photograph. At first glance, it seems like every other post-mortem portrait from the 19th century. Two boys, dressed in their finest clothes, arranged carefully as though asleep, their hair neatly combed, their cheeks still holding the faint flush of youth, a memory preserved for grieving parents. But the Prescott photograph is different. Unlike most post-mortem images, where the lifelessness of the subject is unmistakable, this one carries an unsettling vitality. Edward's lips are slightly parted, not slack but poised, as though he might exhale at any moment. Thomas's posture is relaxed, almost natural, his hand resting gently across his stomach, fingers curved in the faint suggestion of movement. The camera of 1858 captured detail with brutal honesty. There were no digital manipulations, no softened edges. The plates recorded reality in stark chemical precision. And what that plate revealed in the Prescott home was something disturbingly alive. The photographer, his name believed to be Samuel Whitaker, later spoke of his unease. He recalled how Margaret Prescott stood silently in the corner as he set up his heavy equipment. She never approached her sons, never touched their hair or their hands. Instead, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if unable to meet the truth in their faces. Jonathan, however, hovered nearby, commanding, insistent. "Take the picture," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Whitaker adjusted the boys, a common practice in post-mortem photography. Limbs were often posed, eyes sometimes painted onto closed lids to mimic life. But here, he claimed, the bodies resisted. Edward's head lolled gently to the side, as though he were merely drowsy, not stiff. Thomas's chest seemed to rise imperceptibly, and Whitaker swore he paused mid-breath, waiting to see if the boy would wake. The image he captured would become infamous. Those who viewed it later often recoiled, insisting the brothers looked too alive. One local woman, when shown the photograph, dropped it to the floor and declared, "Those children weren't dead." Her words spread quickly, fueling the whispers that had already begun at the funeral. Scholars of dark history have studied the image for decades, debating whether it reveals evidence of premature burial. The angle of Edward's mouth, the slight tension in Thomas's fingers, the absence of the telltale sunken features of death. Some argue that these details were simply the result of Whitaker's skill in arrangement. Others believe they are signs of something more sinister, that the camera captured not corpses, but boys on the edge of consciousness, trapped between life and death. And then there are the shadows. On the right side of the photograph, behind Thomas's chair, a dark shape lingers. At first, it appears to be nothing more than the heavy curtain of the parlor window. But when magnified, some claim the outline resembles a figure, thin, elongated, with hands stretched downward. The family never acknowledged it. The photographer refused to speak of it. But those who study disturbing images insist the shadow was no accident. The Prescott daughters, who appear faintly in the background of another plate, later admitted in adulthood that they hated the photograph. One recalled that whenever she looked at it, she felt as though her brothers were calling to her. "Not gone," she whispered in a diary entry decades later. "Not gone, only hidden." To this day, the photograph is rarely displayed in public collections. Museums that have acquired copies often keep them locked away, citing their disturbing nature. Archivists who have handled it describe feeling cold to the touch, as if the plate itself carries the chill of the Prescott parlor. Some refuse to linger on the image at all, saying the longer one stares, the more the boys appear to breathe. Was it grief that shaped perception? Was it the eerie artistry of a photographer trapped between science and sorrow? Or was it something much darker, an unsettling truth the Prescotts sought to bury, but could never erase from the chemical memory of glass and light? The photograph remains a silent witness, a frozen moment that should not exist, and like all disturbing relics of forgotten events, it refuses to let the story rest. For in every line of that image, in every unsettling detail, the question lingers: were the Prescott brothers truly dead when the camera shutter closed? Or did the photograph capture the instant before the earth swallowed them alive? The photograph had barely been taken before the town of Andover began to whisper. At first, it was quiet, mutters exchanged in kitchens, words carried over fences, murmurs at the general store. But soon the whispers grew louder, and the name Prescott was spoken with an ease. Families who once nodded politely to Jonathan Prescott now crossed the street when he approached. Margaret, once praised for her devotion as a mother, found herself avoided in church pews. The daughters, pale and watchful, were no longer invited to play with the children of neighbors. The sickness that had taken Thomas and Edward was not feared, but the silence that followed was. And always, the photograph returned. Someone claimed to have seen it at the photographer's shop before Jonathan demanded it back. The boys were not gone. The witness whispered, swearing she saw Edward's lips still wet, as though words lingered on them. Another neighbor insisted that when the picture was being shown, the glass plate fogged over, as if breath had touched it. Each retelling grew darker, more elaborate, until the town no longer spoke of the Prescotts as grieving parents, but as keepers of something sinister. Children began to avoid the Prescott property. They said strange sounds came from the house at night, soft knocking, like the muffled beat of fists against wood. One girl, only 8 years old, swore she heard laughter drifting from the graveyard behind the church, even when the air was still. Her parents silenced her, but the fear remained. In taverns, men speculated that Jonathan had rushed the burial for a reason. Perhaps he had debts, and the cost of long vigils would have ruined him. Others whispered that Margaret had been driven mad by grief, insisting her sons were gone even as they clung to life. Still others claimed something darker, that the Prescotts belonged to a family line cursed long before 1858, a line that believed some children were touched and must be silenced before their secret spread. The more the townsfolk whispered, the stranger the details became. One account told of a worker hired to mend the Prescott fence who claimed he saw small handprints pressed into the inside of the parlor window long after the burial. Another spoke of a minister summoned late at night to the Prescott house, his face pale and damp when he left, refusing to answer what he had seen. And then there was the graveyard. For weeks after the funeral, people avoided walking past it at night. Stories spread of faint scratching beneath the soil, of muffled sobs carried through the damp earth. More than one passersby claimed to hear a child's voice calling faintly, "Let me out." Of course, such claims were dismissed as imagination, fueled by gossip and grief. Yet those who heard the sounds never forgot them. The whispers reached a fever pitch when a second photograph surfaced, or so it was claimed. A man traveling from Boston told of seeing an image in Whitaker's studio. The Prescott boys again, but this time with their eyes half open. No record of such a plate exists today, but the story ignited terror. Some swore the photograph had been destroyed, hidden away because it revealed the truth too clearly. Others believed Jonathan Prescott himself had demanded it be smashed. Soon, the Prescotts found themselves isolated, not by choice, but by the heavy weight of suspicion. Their daughters walked with heads lowered, as if carrying secrets too heavy for children. Margaret rarely appeared in public at all, and when she did, her face was gaunt, her eyes ringed in shadow. Jonathan kept to his land, his figure seen late at night moving by lantern light among the barns and sheds, always avoiding the cemetery. The whispers became legend, passed from one household to another until the line between truth and invention vanished. Yet the core of it remained: two brothers buried too soon, a family eager to silence questions, and a photograph that should never have been taken. Generations later, the townsfolk would still recall the story in hushed tones. Old men at the tavern would lean close, telling newcomers, "Don't go near the Prescott graves. Sometimes, if the wind is right, you'll hear them still." The whispers of the town transformed the tragedy into something far more sinister. What might have been dismissed as fever became a tale of living burial. What could have been explained as grief became a story of concealment. And the Prescott name, once respected, became synonymous with fear. But the story did not end there. For rumors have a way of shaping history. And in Andover, whispers carried something more, a warning that some truths were too dreadful to be spoken aloud. For months, the whispers in Andover refused to fade. They grew sharper, heavier, like a sickness of their own. Children crossed themselves when they passed the cemetery. Farmers avoided the road that ran near the Prescott home. taking longer routes through the woods. The story of the brothers spread into nearby towns, until strangers arrived simply to walk past the churchyard, hoping to glimpse the graves where life and death blurred together. And then came the demand. It began quietly, with the minister's hesitation. He had been at the funeral. He had seen the coffins lower into the ground, had heard the faint knocking no one dared acknowledge. His conscience gnawed at him. When parishioners pressed him, asking whether the boys had truly been dead, he had no answer. Soon others joined. Mothers whispered that no child should be buried so swiftly. Fathers muttered that a mistake, if uncorrected, would damn them all. By spring, the whispers had become shouts. The Prescott graves must be opened. Jonathan resisted. Fiercely. He declared it blasphemy, an insult to God and family alike. Margaret pleaded in silence, her face hidden behind her veil. But the town no longer cared for their grief. A petition was drawn, signed, and delivered to the county. Against the Prescott's wishes, the order came. The coffins would be exhumed. The day chosen was overcast, the sky swollen with heavy clouds. Townsfolk gathered by the iron gates of the cemetery, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The gravediggers moved slowly, their shovels cutting into the damp earth. Each clump of soil fell with a weight that seemed louder than thunder. Jonathan stood rigid at the edge of the crowd, his fists clenched at his sides. Margaret clutched her daughters close, their small faces buried in her skirts. At last, the first coffin was reached. Mud-stained, warped by the damp soil, the wooden lid was pried open. Gasps tore through the crowd. Inside lay Edward, the younger brother. His face was pale, but not decomposed as one would expect after months in the ground. His lips were parted, and his fingernails were torn, broken down to the quick. Scratches marred the inside of the coffin lid, long, desperate marks carved into the wood. His hands were twisted unnaturally, frozen in the last spasms of terror. A scream broke from the gathered crowd, silenced only by the minister's trembling prayer. But even he faltered, his voice shaking, his words tripping over themselves. The people stared, unable to look away from the proof before them. Then came the second coffin. Thomas. The lid groaned as it opened, releasing a rush of stale, suffocating air. What they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Thomas lay on his side, his body curled as if he had tried to turn in the narrow space. His mouth was wide open, his teeth bared in what looked like a final cry. His eyes, horribly, were half open, glassy and unseeing. But what froze the blood of every witness was the position of his hands. They were clasped together, pressed against the coffin's lid, as though begging for release. The evidence was undeniable. The Prescott brothers had not died in their beds. They had been buried alive. The town erupted in horror. Some fled, unable to bear the sight. Others fell to their knees, retching or weeping. The minister dropped his Bible into the mud, his faith crumbling under the weight of what he had witnessed. And Jonathan Prescott? He stood motionless, his face as cold and immovable as stone. Only Margaret collapsed, her sobs piercing the silence of the graveyard. The daughters clung to her, their cries drowned by the murmurs rising all around. What kind of man, one woman whispered, would bury his own children alive? Speculation turned swiftly to accusation. Some swore Jonathan had known all along that the rushed burial was no mistake, but deliberate concealment. Others believed the doctor had been complicit, silencing his doubts to avoid scandal. Still others clung to superstition, claiming the boys had been touched by something unnatural, and Jonathan had acted out of fear rather than cruelty. The coffins were closed again, but the damage was done. The Prescott's name was destroyed, their home shunned, their fields abandoned. The exhumation had answered one question, but raised many more. Why had Jonathan been so desperate to bury his sons? What secret had he hoped to bury with them? The town no longer whispered. They spoke aloud, in anger and fear, their voices carrying into every corner of Massachusetts. And the legend of the Prescott brothers grew darker still. For now it was not just a tale of fever or suspicion. It was a story written in wood and bone, in torn fingernails and frozen screams. a story of the living entombed. The graves had been opened. The truth, or something close to it, had been seen. And yet, in Andover, the story did not end with a grisly exhumation. It began again, reborn as something larger, heavier, more poisonous. The Prescott brothers no longer belonged to their family alone. They belonged to the town, to rumor, to the strange, shifting memory of dark history. What had been tragedy became tale, and what had been tale became warning. Parents whispered it to their children in hushed voices. Do not wander into the woods. Do not linger near the graveyard. Remember the Prescott boys. The Prescott home itself soon stood like a monument to dread. No lights burned in its windows after dusk. The shutters remained closed, as if the family wished to seal themselves away from the world or from something within. Travelers who passed by claimed they saw figures moving behind the curtains when no one should have been inside. Some swore they heard scratching, faint and steady, like nails raking against the wooden walls from the inside out. Jonathan Prescott withdrew into silence. He ceased speaking at church, avoided the marketplace, and walked with his head down. Yet his presence was enough to freeze conversation. Men swore his eyes no longer looked human but hollow, reflecting no light, as though he too had been buried and exhumed, alive in body but dead in spirit. Margaret fared no better. Neighbors sometimes spotted her wandering the cemetery alone at night, her black veil glistening with dew. She would stand over her sons' graves for hours, whispering to the earth. Some claimed they saw her place her ear to the soil, listening. Others believed she was speaking to them, still convinced the boys were not gone. And the daughters? Their names faded from the records, but in local memory they were remembered as pale shadows, drifting through the town like wraiths. People said they never smiled again, never married, never escaped the curse of their surname. In later years, when the Prescott house finally fell into disrepair, townsfolk swore the daughters' shapes could still be seen lingering in the broken windows. But the fear stretched beyond the family. The photograph circulated in whispers, copied in secret, tucked into books and drawers. Every time it resurfaced, new details seemed to emerge. Some viewers insisted the boys' lips moved if you stared long enough. Others swore the background shadow, the elongated figure behind the curtain, grew darker with age, more defined, as though it fed on being seen. One archivist, decades later, refused to handle the image at all. It breathes, she muttered. It breathes when no one else is in the room. The town carried this fear like a weight. For years, children refused to play near the cemetery, and parents threatened to send them there as punishment. The Prescott boys are waiting, they would warn, and they will take you down with them. The story became a tool of discipline, a nightmare passed down not to comfort, but to frighten. Over time, the legend spread beyond Andover. Folklorists came, curious to hear the tale firsthand. They left with uneasy expressions, muttering about contradictions in the townspeople's stories, gaps that could not be explained. Historians dismissed the accounts as superstition, fueled by grief and gossip. But those who visited the graves returned with something more than skepticism. They returned with silence, refusing to speak of what they had felt standing before those stones. The Prescott brothers became more than children who died, or were buried alive. They became symbols of every unspoken horror of the 19th century, symbols of post-mortem mistakes, of premature burials, of families silenced by fear and shame. Their story was repeated in sermons, in hushed warnings, in ghost stories told by candlelight. Each telling added another layer of terror, until no one remembered where fact ended and fear began. And yet, some fragments of truth remained. The graves, damp and crooked. The photograph, locked away in private hands. The church record, marked with uneasy handwriting that noted only malignant fever. These fragments became anchors, keeping the story tethered to reality, even as it drifted into nightmare. A legacy of fear settled over Andover like fog. It was not just the fear of death, or of sickness, or of the grave. It was the fear of being forgotten, yet remembered wrongly. The fear of being silenced while still alive. The fear of being seen, but never believed. The Prescott brothers were gone, but their presence lingered, in the whispers, in the shadows, in the photograph that should not exist. Their story was no longer about life or death. It was about the terror of being trapped in between, and the way such terror seeps into the soil, into the memory of a place, until generations cannot escape it. And to this day, the Prescott graves remain. Visitors still leave quickly, refusing to linger too long. Some say the earth feels warm beneath their feet, as though something stirs below. Others claim that if you press your ear to the ground, just as Margaret once did, you will hear it. The faintest sound of scratching, soft and patient, as though it has never truly stopped. The year was 1858, and the world has not forgotten. The Prescott brothers' story has seeped through the cracks of time, carrying with it all the unsettling history of a family cursed by silence, secrecy, and shadows. What began as sickness became suspicion. What began as a funeral became a whisper of horror. And what began as a single photograph became a relic of terror, an image that should never have existed, yet still lingers in dark collections, passed from trembling hands to those curious enough to look. In every retelling, the details shift, but the core remains. Two children, buried before their time. Two small coffins placed in the cold earth of Andover, Massachusetts. Two faces captured forever in post-mortem photography. But behind those pale features lies a chilling truth, that perhaps they were not as dead as the mourners believed. Think of that. Imagine the silence of the graveyard that day, broken only by the scrape of earth against wood. Imagine the mother's trembling hand resting on the coffin lid, her tears falling like rain. Imagine the boys inside, still fighting for air. And imagine the photograph, the shutter clicking in the dim parlor, freezing not death, but something in between. It is here that horror storytelling and history collide. Because whether the Prescott brothers were buried alive or not, the story endures because people believe it could have happened. And it did happen, countless times in the 19th century. The fear of premature burial was real, so real that patents were filed for safety coffins, fitted with bells, flags, and tubes for breathing. So real that families sat up for nights, watching over the supposedly dead, terrified of sealing a loved one away too soon. And so real that entire towns whispered stories like the Prescotts, terrified that tragedy might one day come for them. Look closely at this part of dark history, and you will see the deeper terror. Not just death, but the uncertainty of it. The thought that the grave is not an end, but a prison. That behind every funeral shroud, there may still be a flicker of life. That post-mortem photographs, so ordinary in their time, may sometimes have captured not corpses, but captives. And yet the photograph of the Prescott brothers lingers, more than a century later, as an unsolved mystery. Disturbing images of pale faces, haunting stares, and shadows that seem too deliberate. Scholars debate its authenticity. Collectors whisper of its curse. Local families refuse to look upon it. But it exists, in fragments and whispers, like a forbidden language only the brave or the foolish are willing to speak. The Prescott family itself faded into obscurity. Their home decayed. Their line dissolved. Their names, once spoken in hushed tones across Massachusetts, now barely exist outside records and gravestones. But their story never left. It became a haunting presence in folklore, the kind of tale told by candlelight to keep children awake, staring into the dark corners of their rooms. And what of Andover itself? Even now, some locals swear the cemetery is different, that the Prescott graves carry with them an aura of dread, that animals avoid the spot, that flowers wilt too quickly when placed upon the stones, that the ground itself breathes. The legacy of fear remains, not because of proof, but because of possibility. The Prescott brothers stand as symbols of what the 19th century truly feared, being lost in time, silenced too soon, and trapped forever between life and death. The haunting outro of their story is not simply about them. It is about us, about the photographs we take, the graves we walk past, the stories we inherit without question. It is about the things we choose not to see in old photos, the shadows we dismiss, the eerie details we laugh away. But what if, in those shadows, something still lingers? So the next time you look upon a photograph from forgotten events, linger for just a moment longer. Look closely at the eyes. Study the lips. Watch the shadows behind the subject. Ask yourself, is this truly the stillness of death, or the silence of someone not yet gone? The Prescott brothers' story is more than a tragedy. It is a reminder that history is never as far away as we believe, that death is never as certain as we think, and that beneath every layer of soil, every fading photograph, and every whispered legend, there lies a hidden truth waiting to surface. But beware, because once you start looking for it, you may not be able to stop, and sometimes the shadows look back.